kind of seeing him in the Aristotelian tradition of political philosophy.
Right. Well, you should talk to Spirit Man then. As I understand it, he takes himself to be an incarnation of absolute spirit.
What?
So I don't know.
I don't think I want to talk to this guy then.
Okay, so even though this will be a casual discussion, we'll just start with kind of a basic giving of our positions. And I've already started the recording. So I have debated both of you before on the issue that we're sort of talking about today, although this will not be a debate. I've debated libertarianism with Ivan, and I've debated against nationalism with Joel. Now, the two of you obviously have different positions, and my differences with each of your respective positions are different than the differences you have with one another. So I think this will be a productive discussion. And I think that the dissident right, whatever you want to call it, has sort of dropped arguments against libertarianism. Obviously, many of us used to be libertarianisms. Some of us still are. And it would be good to hear what Joel would have to say against libertarian arguments today, seeing as Joel's up there among the theorists on the dissident right. So let's see where we're starting from. So go ahead, Ivan, if you'd like to start. Give kind of your basic take on libertarianism, especially like vis-a-vis the nation question. Oh, I think you're muted. I can't hear you.
Still kind of you.
I can edit this out too. So
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, we'll just cut that bit out. It's fine. I can hear you now, Ivan.
Okay, we good now?
mhm.
All right, that was, I don't know what that was. Sorry about that. Anyway, well, libertarianism I see as a philosophy of law. It's a philosophy of law that basically specifies what the proper conditions are for when it is acceptable to use violence. And since it is a philosophy of law, that implies that it doesn't necessarily have an answer for every conceivable social question or moral question or question that might be, of interest to how people live their lives, but it isn't intended to be so. It's intended to deal with a fairly narrow range of issues, and then it doesn't really necessarily specify how to arrive at an answer at various other things. It doesn't give you a complete philosophy of how to live your life, but it's concerned with that one basic question of when it's acceptable to use violence. And the answer that libertarianism comes to on that question comes from a theory of property. So basically, we can think of it this way: property is necessary to any kind of social order whatsoever. It is necessary to it because resources are scarce and they can be put to all sorts of uses. And it is possible, of course, that in the course of social existence, that conflicts may arise between various people about who may or may not make use of some resource. When such a conflict arises, we need a set of rules to delineate who is correct and who is incorrect with regard to their claims, and therefore who may use the given resource and who may not use it. And that system of rules is what we call a property system in general. And libertarianism specifies a particular set of rules. So if some piece of property is unowned, then the first person to, well, the term is homestead, but what this essentially comes out to is that you interact with the resource and you do something to change it in an intersubjectively verifiable way, such that it becomes clear to others around you in your society that you've done something. And through doing this, you establish a claim on the property. Secondly, if the property is owned, it may be transferred from one owner to another via a voluntary transfer. And the consequences of these two rules basically create a whole property system for you. And from that, we derive concepts of like what aggression is. Aggression is basically um, any any attempt to damage or take property that falls outside what's allowable by these rules and so on. So in a very kind of basic way, that's what libertarianism is. As it relates to the nation's question, well, libertarianism doesn't specify any particular way that one might live. There are various sorts of social arrangements that are compatible with this framework. So you can live, for example, in an ethnically or racially homogenous community. There's nothing wrong with that. If that's what you want to do, if that's something you like, if you believe that that's something that's conducive to your happiness, very well, you may live that way. Similarly, if you want to live in some other community organized according to some sort of different principles, that too is acceptable. But so it doesn't really specify any definite mode of living. It's compatible with a variety of them. And I guess the final thing I'd say is specifically as regards the nation. I mean, we have to sort of have a definition of what is meant by the nation. But I think Joel will accept this, that the nation is some combination of a biological concept that is, partly genetic, partly due to genetic similarity, but also partly due to something like shared history, shared culture, and so on. And there's some combination of that creates what we call nations. Uh, Libertarianism, as such, has nothing to say in objection to nations in that sense as kind of like organic communities. The only objection that it might have is specifically to the institution of the state being a particular institution with very specific properties. So it claims a monopoly on violence within a given territorial area. It also claims itself to be the ultimate decision maker within that territory. It claims the right to tax, that is to, take property or wealth in some other form from other people without their consent and use it for whatever it wants to use it for. And insofar as the state is an instrument of the nation or is in some way involved in the nation, libertarians will object to nationalism in that sense. But in the general sense of just like some community that's bonded by genetic similarity or a shared language or a shared history, there's like nothing wrong with that. That's fine. That's really it. That's really all libertarians have to say on the question of nations. Is there something else you'd like me to discuss regarding that?
No, I think that's good to start with. Maybe just the question of how libertarians treat corporate personhood in principle. Like,
Well, I mean, the details of that, there isn't a set line for it. The details of that would have to depend on whatever the particular explicit agreement happens to be that the group of individuals involved in the corporate entity have arrived at. So if you have some charter for a corporation, for example, that charter will specify exactly how what that corporate entity is. And as far as the concept of corporate personhood in general, it's really just like an administrative convenience. Because if you have some corporate entity that consists of like thousands of individuals, and then it has to like go to court, it's extremely inconvenient to sue like thousands of individuals personally. It just becomes a mess. So you consolidate it into one thing to sort of simplify and streamline legal procedures and that sort of thing.
okay, cool. So basically, in the opinion of libertarians, the existence of the nation doesn't legitimate any particular state form. Of course, all state forms are illegitimate in libertarians' eyes. So, Joel, if you could go ahead and that was about 8 minutes, so 8 minutes or so, to give your current position. Do you have a label for where you stand right now? And yeah, where are you coming from on this question?
Yeah, I think it'd be more interesting if we're going to do like a debate here. It'd be more interesting to debate communitarianism versus libertarianism, because that's really what's pertinent in, like, what is property, the ethics of the state and these kinds of questions, as opposed to nationalism specifically, because I would derive the legitimacy of nationalism and its claims upon, you know, representation within states and so on, from communitarian priors. And as Ivan says himself, it's not necessarily the case that you couldn't have like a libertarian nationalism. Obviously, we have many cases of liberal, like classical liberal nationalisms, um, and classical liberalism and libertarianism. I mean, he just kind of gave a quasi Lockean kind of definition. Obviously, there's a lot of similarity in these two schools, just that classical liberals do have some way of getting a state out of those priors, that presumably Ivan disagrees with. Um, but yeah, so I think the basic element of where I see communitarianism coming in here, against libertarianism is, I mean, first we can talk about property, I guess. I mean, the way that
If you don't
he's
mind, can we
described-
first just describe communitarianism and what that is?
Yeah, so communitarianism is, as opposed to liberalism, where the individual and individual rights are kind of like the fundamental unit upon which you kind of establish a social ontology and a kind of a notion of justice. Communitarians, they don't completely annihilate the individual as having any significance, but they say, well, the community is another kind of unit which has to be kind of taken into consideration here when figuring out these questions. Um, so when it comes to property, for example, um, property rights in the communitarian fold are kind of understood within the paradigm of stewardship. That, like, in order for a community to kind of pursue the common good, in like a kind of, Aristotle would be a communitarian in this sense. In order for a community to pursue its common good, ultimately it needs to have good stewardship over its resources. People have to take care of things, obviously, run the economy and these kinds of things. And so assigning people property rights, and respecting property rights and developing norms around property rights are a way to strengthen stewardship in the community. So in Aristotle's Politics, one example that he gives is, well, if you imagine a community, because he's criticizing Socrates' remarks in the Republic, and he's kind of criticizing this idea of not having monogamous marriage norms, and saying, well, look, if we just kind of share all the women, then we're not going to be as good stewards over women as if we all like if we marry them off to individuals. Because if it's your wife, then you're going to invest so much in taking care of her and so on. Whereas if it's just your wife for the night, but then you bang another girl the next week and so on, you don't have any kind of particular commitment to any particular woman, and so all the women are just kind of held in common. And he also uses this analogy to describe children, to say, well, if we just hold all the children or the women in common, as opposed to having stewardship of individual fathers, individual husbands, they're actually not, like, as a net, they're going to be looked after much worse. So to look after all of them as a whole, we need to kind of break up stewardship into this kind of individuated structure. And you can kind of see how this analogy would extend to, like particular things. Like, for example, you're going to do a much better job of, mowing your own lawns and taking care of your own gardens, than if it was just like your job to mow the community's lawns that week or something. And things that are held in common are often, not looked after in near as well as things that are looked after as individuals. Because if you have a property claim over something, then you have this kind of perpetual investment that you're incentivized to maintain. This actually, funnily enough, was a similar argument to the one that Hopper made, the libertarian, when he was describing why monarchy is better than democracy, which is interesting. He was describing that, if you have a kind of a monarchy that inherits the throne, they have, they have to kind of consider, well, I'm going to have to pass down this nation to my children and to my grandchildren and so on. And so you're going to have this kind of long-term thinking that defines policy making, as opposed to if you just have to get elected every 4 years, you're going to think about, well, how can I win the next election? How do I win the next election? As opposed to in 50 to 100 years, what is the state of the community going to be? And so stewardship, I think, is a very, even a famous libertarian will agree, as Hopper, that stewardship is a very logical way to think about what is virtuous about property, what is the end of property. And this kind of teleological understanding of property is kind of where I come from and why I side with the communitarians against, I think, the liberals. I don't really buy this idea that you get from the liberal tradition, that just because you as an individual mix your labor with the land, that you have some ipso facto, kind of absolute right to homestead, or an absolute right over particular property claims. I think for the community to respect your rights, there has to be some way of working out why it's in the community's collective interest to respect your particular interest, because that really is the essence of what a community is people coming together for the greater good, for the common good, as opposed to for the individual good. Now, obviously, it is in the common good for various individual goods to be protected, but the whole is more than the sum of its parts, and the whole is necessary to sustain the parts. Um, you know, Otherwise, you have yeah. So I just don't really buy this idea of the kind of absolute kind of origin point of individual rights. I don't think it's ethically defensible in absolute terms, even though it is in many particular cases. Yeah, I just don't think it really makes sense of what it means to be like a social being, which is kind of the essence of what it is to be a human being.
Okay, I would just interject really quickly before Ivan responds, and then you can take the discussion wherever. It's kind of ironic that that's that argument that Aristotle gives is in favor of as much private property as is possible, but then you're noting that it shouldn't be an absolutized right to private property, and you have to consider that stewardship for the good of the community and the common good. The questions here will be, who determines the common good? Is it a product of the will of all the individuals comprising the whole? What happens when people don't value the nation anymore, as is the case in many modern Western nations? So, yeah, I'm interested to hear where you guys go with that. Ivan, I know you had some questions, specifically on that for Joel. So,
Right. Well. Before I get to that, just to respond to what Joel just said now specifically, I don't disagree with any of what he just said. Really, I don't quite see where why it is that what he said is not compatible with what I had said. Remember, I had begun my discussion of property by saying that the reason that institution is important within a social context is that it's necessary to prevent conflicts from raging on interminably over who may or may not use scarce resources. That's obviously a social good. Right? That's obviously something conducive to social harmony. So I don't see the problem there. Secondly, what Joel discussed about stewardship, this is just what's called the tragedy of the commons, or a variant of that. Libertarians discuss this all the time. They point out quite often that if you have publicly owned property, or really, to be clear about it, it's what people call public property is really just a situation where property rights are not clearly defined, where it's not clearly specified precisely who owns what. When that situation doesn't exist, there is an incentive to exploit some resource, overexploit it, deplete it, and end up wasting it. Which is why, for example, you might have, there are cases in the Soviet Union where they had publicly owned, state-owned lakes, fisheries, that sort of thing, and there were just environmental disasters occurring as a result of this because no one could claim individually or specifically that they owned this particular lake, and therefore no one had any incentive to preserve it, and so it got ruined. Um, so again, like none of what Joel is saying is at variance with my position. Um, even if I'm saying that individuals, or really corporate entities as a kind of legal structure, because you can have a corporate entity claim ownership over something within a libertarian context. There's no problem there. Still, I am also saying, like he is, that the ultimate purpose of property is to avoid conflict, and therefore generate social harmony. So we're both in agreement that there's like a social good being aimed at by property.
Well, I disagree that it's just purely to prevent conflict. That would be like a Hobbesian notion that there's this war of all against all that the social order has to be kind of constructed to prevent. Um, but I actually, if you put Hobbes in context, Hobbes is speaking in the context of the English Civil War. Basically, he's trying to argue against the claims of Catholicism. Um, he's trying to argue essentially against a kind of free civil society, which can lead to crises and argue fundamentally for like a kind of absolutist monarchy that asserts itself over the public sphere, and you kind of relegate your if you differ with the king on how to interpret the scriptures, or on social policy, you keep that to yourself. That's relegated to the private realm, because the ultimate social good is peace, not virtue. And I would push back against that and say, well, no, I mean, obviously peace is good. I'm not saying peace is bad, but it's not the exclusive kind of thing that we're aiming for in society. We're aiming at virtue, which is, I think, more holistic. So I think a more classical conception of political philosophy would say that property doesn't just simply exist for the sake of preventing us fighting over resources, but it exists for the sake of using resources well. And using resources well is more complex than just not fighting over them. It also entails things like, sometimes I think you're going to need to have property in common. I could think of some examples. One would be like, if you look at something like technological development. Um, Technological development, particularly in like contemporary society, is incredibly it's incredibly high risk and high investment. So you basically need to be able to pour billions and billions of dollars for years into, if you're thinking about like advanced military technologies, and like the cutting edge of many of the most advanced fields in research and development. These are things where you basically need to have billions of dollars lying around, and you need to basically defer getting a kind of return on them for decades in order to achieve anything, which is why the state is so integral to so much of cutting edge technology in the post-war era. Um, Now, if you completely got rid of taxation, for example, um, that would probably stagnate technological development, therefore, because there would just be no one in society that would be able to make those kinds of risks. And there's other social goods as well that come from common property, like things like schemes for privatizing the roads. These things have been theorized, and privatizing transportation as being not really the best. The emergence of natural monopolies and what to do about them. There are all kinds of the issues of how you deal with externalities. There are all other kinds of issues with a purely libertarian system that have come up, and so I would advocate for more of like a mixed system. But I think communitarianism allows you to evaluate when is something when is it in the social interest to have a kind of common property solution, to have a kind of more kind of status solution. When is it in the common interest to have a kind of private solution, rather than just ideologically boxing ourselves off that we have to only have private solutions for everything. I would reject that. And again, I would also reject the communists who want to have a public solution for everything as well. I think both of these views are incorrect. I think the communitarian justification for property frees you up to be able to just kind of pragmatically kind of go through on a case by case basis what's actually in the interest of the community.
All right, so all right. Well, I guess in response to that first, um, I don't claim either that the only purpose of property is to prevent conflict. There are, of course, other goods that can arise from a property system. Property systems enable uh, specialization, the division of labor, economic development, and then essentially every social good whatsoever that proceeds from that, because you do need to have some kind of economic base of wealth before you can pursue the sciences, the arts, these other sort of things that aren't directly related to sort of acquiring your kind of physical subsistence. And a property system is necessary as the basis for that. So out of the emergence of a property system, which is created to prevent um, conflicts over scarce goods from emerging, you will have the result of these other goods flowing out of it. Once again, like there's no contradiction there. You can attain as a kind of side effect all of these same goods. It's built into and implied by that structure. Regarding the specific point of like technological development, and the point you made that enormous investments are necessary in order to have large scale technological development, and that private firms won't do this if the state doesn't intervene. There's an interesting history to the development of this argument. Basically, it emerged. I want to say like just after Sputnik. Basically, what happened is the Soviets launched Sputnik, and the U.S. government got spooked, got terrified that the Soviets might surpass them technologically, and so they went to the Rand Corporation and told the Rand Corporation to hire a few economists and tell them to write papers about why the government needs to get involved in the funding of scientific research, but that this justification has to be made within the context of a market system. Like it can't be pure communist because obviously USA, and we have to, distinguish ourselves from the Soviets. So the result of that was two papers, one written by Kenneth Arrow and the other by Richard Nelson, and they both argue essentially the same thing, which is that in perfectly competitive markets, no one pays for R&D. And the funny thing about the argument is that it follows by definition from the model of what a perfectly competitive market is. In a perfectly competitive market, number one, all knowledge, everyone has perfect knowledge. That is, everyone knows how everyone will act in the future, how they will react to everything. Obviously, an unrealistic assumption, but this is kind of assumed within neoclassical theory as part of the model. And the second assumption is that all products are homogeneous. So they kind of rub out all of the real world distinctions between like actual products made in actual markets. And if you make those two assumptions, then it follows by definition that no one will do R&D. But only someone who's familiar with the technical ins and outs of neoclassical theory is going to realize that this whole argument is circular bullshit, basically. And to Richard Nelson's credit, he admitted later on that this was the case. Kenneth Arrow did not, which might explain why Arrow won the Nobel Prize and Nelson didn't. But this was what started the entire process of like the government getting involved in R&D. As far as whether companies will invest in R&D without taxation, well, I mean, the empirical evidence is yes, they will. Companies that do invest in R&D, and there's empirical evidence for this galore, do have higher profit margins on average than those who don't. There is a relationship there. I mean, you can also point to, I'm trying to think of examples off the top of my head, but Roche, the biotech company, it's a Swiss company, and the Swiss government hardly invests anything in science. In Switzerland, it's done pretty much all privately. Roche is the fifth largest biotech company in the world. For a while, it used to be the largest. It's got a market cap of about $250 billion. It's enormous. And, so clearly the private market is able to do this, and there are reasons to conduct R&D. There are first mover advantages to doing this, meaning that if you make some discovery in your lab and you take advantage of it as being the first person to make the discovery, there's that. And then there are also second mover advantages. So it might be that some other firm develops a product, but is either unable to market it well, or is not able to make the sorts of improvements that, certain important improvements. Then another firm, by interacting with other scientists, by reading their papers, is able to perceive this and make those improvements. So even if you aren't the first to discover something and you just make a subsequent improvement on it, there's still enormous money to be made in that. companies realize this because they know that the only way to make any kind of scientific or technological advances is to allow the scientists working for them to interact with one another, to engage in discussion. And this is why an enormous amount of what companies who hire scientists tell them to do is to spend time reading other people's papers. Um, and then for reading other people's papers, they sort of allow them to conduct their own research, even if the possibility of a new discovery is relatively small. But I mean, the point I'm making here is that no, in fact, it is the case that private companies do this without funding by the state. It does, in fact, happen.
Yeah, I mean, I wasn't arguing that private companies never invest in R&D. My apologies if I gave that impression. I was arguing, however, that there are many forms of investment which they are less incentivized to do. And empirically, the number one investor in science and research and development in the world is the US Defense Department. Um, so, I mean, that's something that's important to kind of consider because obviously
Well,
that's just like pure tax dollars.
one thing on that, I mean, it's private corporations that are funded that get government contracts that are coming up with these innovations, DARPA, Lockheed Martin, Boeing, etc. And in a libertarian context, without the monopoly on force of governments, there would be a broader market for that kind of research. So in the current day, when there is a monopoly on force, of course, the big defense contractors, the people researching this stuff, will be serving the state in another context. But anyway, there's one other flip side of this argument that I would like to hear your take on. So you're taking the angle that the state accelerates technological development, and that's good. I am afraid of technology, and I'm anti-Skynet. So what about like the costs that get socialized when there are multiple actors looking for that first mover advantage? Like if you're one nation or one corporation and you want to rush this product out to market, like a new vaccine or whatever, and maybe it has dangerous consequences, but there's money to be made and you have to push it out as soon as possible. Like, how does the libertarian position address that tragedy of the commons issue, and then how does the nationalist or communitarian side?
Well, I mean, I would jump in with the obvious point that whether if you're saying the issue is like how do you stop bad technologies, I don't really see how the libertarians have any way of stopping bad technologies because everyone has the freedom to pursue whatever technological development they want to under libertarianism. Only with statism could you even have a way of restricting these technologies in the first place. So
The libertarian answer is that because the state is so enormous and because it's able to marshal enormous resources and because it wields a monopoly on violence and is generally accepted by the public as being legitimate, when it does something stupid or destructive, the consequences are enormous. Whereas if a private company were to make a mistake or to do something idiotic, the consequences would tend to be localized because the company is smaller and is less able to do damage, and it doesn't have that kind of, I guess you'd call it legitimacy advantage that goes with like everyone believing in it. So if some company develops some dangerous product, some vaccine with like bad side effects, I don't know how freely I can speak about this, but you know where I'm going with this. Let's say a private company in a libertarian context develops this, and then there's like some database hypothetically that like tracks adverse side effects from vaccines. Well, no one is going to suppress knowledge of what's filtered into the database. No one has the ability to suppress that or silence that. And in fact, the competitors of the first company would probably want others to know if there are negative side effects from their competitor's product because they want to get an advantage over their competitor. So no, there would be a tendency to like localize damage.
I mean, I don't know how you can really say that because if you look at who is suppressing information around particular issues in society today, it doesn't seem to be the state in so much it is privately owned social media companies and so on. So this idea that the free market is like pro liberty, again, I don't really see evidence for that. There are natural monopolies that have kind of emerged with social media, and the only solution that I can really see to them is either some benevolent billionaire um, buying out one of these social media companies and reforming it, or the state stepping in and securing people's rights to freedom of speech
One
on
thing,
these, declaring them utilities or something.
it was the state that gave immunity to companies for lawsuits, and you can't have that in a libertarian order. But
And Mark Zuckerberg did explicitly say that, like, the FBI came to Facebook and was like, we want you to suppress certain stories. I'll be vague because this is going up on YouTube, but, like, yeah, the FBI was, like, explicitly there. Not only that, but the intelligence agencies were involved with these social media companies from the beginning because they realized the enormous potential that they had for surveillance. Obviously, in a libertarian system, you wouldn't have this. So,
Yeah,
right,
I mean,
this
I think most of the social media companies spun out of like DARPA in the first place, so they were like
yeah,
developed by the state, really.
Google was a Stanford project. I mean, it's all state led. So this is all technical and historical, and we'd have to look at specific recent history to resolve that. So let's take it back to kind of the first principles here. What I see happening is in the libertarian solution to the commons and the common good, individual property owners are responsible for the kind of telic information in the system. Intention, goals, the good that people perceive is individually accountable. And it's a bunch of different people making those individual calculations. And of course, they will not be ignorant of the good of the people around them. If people naturally have nationalist sentiments, then individual property owners might, also think about the common good of the nation when they're acting in their own self-interest. But then on the other side, if we say that there is some non-market and non-individual way of ascertaining the common good, what is that? How does that operate? I'm not against the idea that something like that is possible, but it's a matter of how are we tracing who determines the nature of the common good? As I said in the beginning, I think this is the most important disagreement. So how does that work?
I would reject the liberal idea that the common good is just the sum total of individual decisions about individual goods. I think the common good is something which you need to reason to on the basis of a kind of dispassionate analysis of what's in the community's interest, like putting your emotions and your personal interests to the side while making that assessment. And I think in order to be able to make those assessments, you need to be well trained, a highly capable individual, particularly when you're thinking about, well, what's in the economic interests of a nation of millions of people. You need to be an expert to be able to make that determination. You can't just walk in with no knowledge of economic theory or anything like that and work that out. And the same is true in all the different areas, international relations, whatever, all different policy areas. So I think this necessitates a elite of people who are kind of trained in capacity to reason technically about various social issues, to be making decisions on behalf of the community. Um, because I don't think the average person has the capacity, or any one person really, in the ultimate sense, has the capacity to make all the relevant calculations necessary to work out what is actually in the common, what actually is the common good. Maybe in basic terms, but in like a fully fleshed out way. And so that's why I think a kind of elite needs to have authority over society to impose governance, in the interest of the common good.
all right, well, I actually agree with what Joel said, that the average person, or really any person at all, probably within his own head, within the remit of his own knowledge, probably would not be able to ascertain in a general way what the common good is. And it's precisely because I believe that I favor a market solution to these kind of things. to just talk, for example, about the economic side of the issue. What is in the economic interest of a nation, let's say? Well, your typical nation has millions of people. There are, enormous, unfathomable amounts of economic transactions happening every day. The system itself is mind-bogglingly complex. And it's simply not possible to process that amount of information and direct it from a central location, because it's the amount of it is just enormous. And therefore what markets do is they take every individual who acts within his own individual remit, within the remit of what he knows personally, his own contacts, his own associates, his own social circle, whatever that is, things that he has local knowledge of. He acts within that context, and then has whatever consequences it has, through, like, let's say, a price system, for example. A good example would be the price system. Let's focus on this. So when people exchange goods, or when prices emerge for something, this is the result of jostling between supply and demand. So you have buyers in a market versus sellers, and sellers are aiming at the highest selling price, and buyers want to buy at the lowest price, and they meet in the middle in such a way that the greatest number of people on both sides are satisfied, and the price converges to whatever the market level is. This isn't something completely arbitrary. There is important social information within a market price. And that information basically tells you something about the general social constellation of values for particular goods within society. And without the existence of the information that's been sort of crystallized into this price, there's no way that someone could just determine this a priori without examining it. Like the amount of information to process would be unfathomable. So the market kind of takes this, localizes it into a single data point emergently, and then you're actually able to act and make reasonable decisions in the world. But without that context, you'd be lost. You'd just be completely swamped with information overload, and you wouldn't know what to do.
Well, number one, I'm not opposed to having markets in various cases, but there are market failures. I don't see why the price system is going to magically determine the common good, like how you get from some total of people that are making decisions that aren't in the interest of the common good, and then you just kind of add them all together, and then the outcome is the common good. I don't really see how that calculation is possible. Like, for example, if you have a market in heroin or a market in pornography, I don't really see how working out that a bunch of people want to buy heroin is in the common good, or working out a bunch of people, there's a market out there for pornography. There's a market for all kinds of things that are bad. And so those markets, in my view, should be abolished and should be restricted by a more virtuous elite who recognizes that those individual wills that want to participate in that market are immoral, and therefore their freedom needs to be restricted.
A market is a tool. It's a means for carrying out coordination of resources. And that's one of the things that you have to handle in a society. Resources have to be moved around, they have to be coordinated. And markets are an efficient means of doing that. But just because they have this function, I'm not implying by this that there's some kind of universal, ethic to this, that whatever comes out of a market, you could theoretically have slave markets, for example. I wouldn't be in favor of this, even though there are market dynamics that could be analyzed. Yes, obviously you'd have to do this within the context of some ethical framework. I'm just making the point that a market is a tool for coordinating resources. And if you forego this tool, it's going to be virtually impossible to coordinate resources properly across any large-scale society. And it really doesn't matter how intelligent or how well educated the elite that's trying to do this is, because the amount of information is just unfathomable.
But what we're really arguing about is where the limits on markets come from, because I don't really understand how you can be a libertarian and impose any limits upon markets outside of maybe like you could maybe impose a limit if you couldn't have slave markets or something, because that would be kind of contrary, like that would be contrary to individual liberty for someone to be in slavery. But there's a whole bunch of markets which I don't really understand how your fundamental, like your first principles can justify limiting in the first place, and how anyone is even in a position, if you don't have states, to even decide upon and unilaterally impose these limits. So, I mean, like, I'm not here I'm not a communist. I'm not arguing that all markets need to be abolished. I'm just saying, well, there is market failure, and so therefore markets need to be limited, and that requires ethical judgments made by an elite who is sovereign over markets, and therefore over the individuals who participate in them.
Okay, well, you're using market failure, the term, differently from how it's typically used. I mean, typically it's used to denote the allegation that,
Like inefficiency or something.
yeah, or like they fail to coordinate resources properly. What you're saying is that they
Well,
might
it's a
commit.
moral failure.
Yeah, right.
Uh, yeah.
Okay. Uh, well, the moral temper of the society is going to be what determines, like, what kinds of markets are prevalent. So, like, for example, in 1950s America, you actually could buy contraceptives, like they were available, but hardly anyone did because social pressure was just such that people weren't drawn to doing that sort of thing. So there wasn't terribly much money to be made in it. So you could restrict certain markets socially without a state based on the prevalence of a certain ethical temper within your society.
But what I seem to be getting from you is, you don't actually have. I mean, I'm not saying this about you, but from like putting your system together, what you seem to be saying is fundamentally nihilistic. That, well, it's just like whatever the participants believe in. If people believe in bad ideas, they're free to organize their society around bad ideas and make morally bad choices. Where I would say no, like, your freedom doesn't exist prior to your virtue. Your, like, freedom is something that is won by virtue. So this idea that, well, you could have a society where people are not buying contraceptives, and so you should just work it out that way. Well, why? If we have a society like we have now where people are using contraceptives, that produces so many different social ills. They should just be banned. They should just be made illegal.
Well, here, I mean, there is a market solution kind of at a higher level. Maybe some nations, some groups of people just suck and should fail, and the market will correct for it. The people who make good decisions will stick around.
Yeah,
Why?
I mean,
So you don't care about what? So you just want to allow societies to go, like, that seems to be fundamentally immoral as well. Like, you should be aimed at the common good, and therefore you should be aimed at correcting
well,
bad behavior elements.
okay, this sort of gets to another basic disagreement that I have with Joel, which is like, your view is that the state is a tool for the attainment of the common good, provided at least that it's in the hands of, properly virtuous or competent people. My view is basically that the purpose of the state is to allow those who control it to plunder those who don't, right? And so, like, these people are not going to care about, like, what's moral or not. They're going to be out for themselves. And the reason they're going to be out for themselves is because they're not going to face significant consequences for being out for themselves. They're not going to face significant consequences for this because of the nature of the state form itself. So if a private company in a libertarian context does something stupid, like, let's say, creates a medicine with horrific side effects, that information is going to get out there. It's going to lose money, and it's going to face a choice. You either change your behavior, you withdraw the product, or you go bankrupt. And you have limited tolerance for this, so you better act as quickly as you can. The state is not under that limitation. If the state is running out of money, it can print more or it can tax more. And so there's an essentially unlimited incentive to just do evil to the hilt. And this is, in fact, what happens in practice in the state. And if the only stopgap that you have against this is, like, the inherent moral virtue of, like, some good people, I consider that to be a pretty thin reed. Like, Eric knows this from his discussion with me, but I'm a pretty serious pessimist about human nature, and I don't think that most people can be trusted to behave unless they're like, given some incentive to, and unless it's tied into their self-interest in some tangible way that they behave well. The problem with the state fundamentally is that it severs that connection and therefore makes it attractive to engage in immoral behavior. It makes it easy to get away with it.
Okay, so the question here is about who gets into an elite position and why that elite should be trusted. But there are technical details as far as why we should expect state elites to be morally inferior or superior, depending on your relative positions. The more, I think, essential question here is that question of like, I mean, basically it is how does that elite that comes into a position of prominence have privileged epistemic access to the nature of goodness? I will say that in a market context, you have Pareto distributions. Most of the decisions will be made by a small set of people, and they will be selected in a way to be competent at least. So why should we not expect them also to be virtuous? And then on the question of like the kind of cultural, biological, national aspect, if this is real and there is a natural cohesion that takes place, then a market elite would naturally care about that biological type, that actual thing. And here's the point that I wanted to get to also. I kind of hyperbolized before saying some nations suck, but the question is like, are nations ipso facto good? Are there some nations that aren't worth preserving? Not that you should eliminate all the people in the nation, but should the national identity always be preserved for its own sake, or is it a means to an end of the common good? So,
in my view, it's a means to an end of the common good.
Okay.
Well,
but
that's also my view, yeah.
The nation, like ultimately, I'm a Christian, so ultimately the kind of value of anything is determined by its relation to God. And, the Bible's quite clear, to love God is to keep his commandments. So the value of a nation is fundamentally bound up with its virtuousness or its obedience to God. But from that, though, when thinking about from one's personal or individual perspective, you were born within a particular people, particular community, just like you're born within a particular family. And so I think this carries over a kind of like natural set of obligations to have responsibilities to your people and to your family. So the, honor thy father and mother, very clear commandment. And St. Thomas Aquinas extended this commandment to say that you basically have a duty of piety, which extends into a duty of patriotism, because to honor thy father and mother means to honor your ancestry in general, which there corresponds to your ethnic group or your nation. So your responsibility is, as an individual, is to the virtue of your own people. God has placed you in that position by the circumstances of your birth and your life. But this isn't to say that the nation necessarily deserves to survive because you have an obligation to it. You can have an obligation to something which is nevertheless failing and just maybe deservedly so, because ultimately it is kind of responsible for its own actions. But like cycling back to what you're saying about like markets, the kind of fundamental, you talked about incentives. Apparently the state is just incentivized to just plunder and exploit its own population in perpetuity. But like I don't really see that as being the case. The state also has various incentives to pursue the virtue of its own population, because ultimately its strength is kind of dependent upon its relation to its population. So if the economy is going badly, well, that means that you have less power for the state, for example. Or if your birth rates are falling, again, this is another crisis that the state has to deal with, and so on. So states historically have aligned with religious traditions, have developed kind of ideological kind of self-images and notions of legitimacy that justify their rule on the basis of the common good of the community they're ruling. Also, they have to worry about revolutions from inside and so on. So, because states, their strength is kind of determined by the relation to the community that they govern, and because their legitimacy to govern that community is kind of drawn from the community's ends in some fundamental way. Okay, I'm not saying states are perfect, but they do have natural mechanisms and incentives to not just simply plunder their own people for the enrichment of the state itself. And what we actually see in society today, in my view, is not the state pursuing its own self-interest to plunder people, but the state being used by various elite groups, private interest groups, and special interest groups and minority groups to plunder the majority population in their interest as opposed to the state's interest. So I agree. Of course, there are kind of problems with how do you get a virtuous leadership in control of the state? And that really is the perennial political problem. How do you have virtuous governance? Well, I just don't really see libertarianism as offering a solution to this. Let's just abolish the state entirely or something because we can't figure out the answer to the problem. Seems to be what you're saying.
All right. Well, I can agree in kind of a general philosophical sense that the good is to imitate God, to try and approach God, that God is like the ultimate good, and through contemplation, through piety, through moral action, or what have you, we approach the good in that sort of general sense. So you can say that in kind of a general way, but within the context of like a finite world, within the context of like a physical world that we inhabit, there are various goods. So if you have as a general kind of philosophical approach to the good, let's say you favor like some teleological notion, which relates to like the development of, let's say, your own potentialities. Well, everyone has various potentialities, and you can develop them in various ways, and you can't necessarily develop all of them. You have to make choices about which ones to develop and which ones not to. And because you inhabit a finite world with finite resources, you have finite intelligence, finite time. You can't do all of these things. So then you have a coordination problem on your hands, which is, okay, what do I develop versus not? And this is where the use of markets come in, because they're an efficient coordinating mechanism. So if you sort of just behave with respect to other people in your society, and you're not insulated by the state from kind of negative feedback, then your behavior will be altered in such a way as to, respect what other people require of you. So like, I'll give an example. Like, we can agree that, promiscuity and like welfareism and these kind of things are bad. Now, if you didn't have a state to subsidize the underclass, and essentially allow them to engage in this behavior, they would face consequences for it, and there would presumably be less of it. So the state is encouraging this actively, and it's not just an accident. It's not like the people in charge of the state are like trying to do well and help the poor, but it's just, oh, too bad it's not working out and we can't figure out the right solution. I don't buy that. I think this is deliberate. I think that they want a dissolute, weak population that's like unable to control itself, that is that succumbs to like every impulse and desire, and that essentially comes to view the state as a surrogate parent with like magical powers, because that sort of population is easy to control. So it's in their interest to create this kind of population because it serves the state. It serves the power interests of the elite. So just to make a distinction about, like a slight distinction about what you said earlier, Joel, well, it's not in the state's interest to just plunder endlessly. That's true, but there are rational ways to plunder a populace. You can restrict your theft because you understand that if you plunder too much now, you will damage the economy and inhibit your ability to plunder in the future. And so you moderate your theft. That's a kind of rational thievery, and states that behave that way do tend to survive longer. But it nevertheless remains the case that you have an elite that is plundering the populace through the machinery of the state. Um, you know, see, what else did you say? I mean, I think that generally gets to what I was driving at. It's, I guess, to put it in a general way, uh, the purpose of the state is to insulate a certain class of people from the negative consequences of social feedback. It's to prevent the circulation of elites, or to make it more difficult for the elite to circulate. If you're if you're part of the elite in a pure market context, you're only able to achieve that status because you serve the populace. You give them something that they want and that they're willing to pay for. And not only that, but you assiduously track the changes in the valuations of the people whom you're serving, and you're able to competently and efficiently respond to those changes. And so you earn your position, and you're under constant threat of losing that position. Whereas if you're a member of the elite connected with the state, you can insulate yourself from that. You can remain in power despite blatantly not deserving to be in power. So you get these like unimpressive, criminals that rise to the top, which is what we see. You can explain this as just the result of the inherent failures of human nature, and that's certainly true. But there are also inherent structural features of the state form itself that make this a predictable outcome.
Okay, so yeah, that the point about elite accountability is key. So the allegation is that the state insulates elites from the consequences of their actions. In a market, people are more accountable. In my debate with you, Ivan, maintained that it may be possible to construct a system in which there is more accountability in a state form. So the a priori advantage of a market over a state, I'm not totally convinced by. So Joel, like, what is your response to this? How do you keep state elites accountable? Because again, like, looking at a market context, you're going to have competent people who make most of the decisions, the relevant decisions that inform the nature of the national type, the biological entity you're concerned about. And also, like, people will have options, like in a kind of Hoppian, what does he call it exactly? But a Hoppian, like, pseudo-state context where property owners can run their own societies and, like, prohibit heroin, prohibit whatever they want to prohibit within the confines of their private property. So people can go for whatever kind of, pseudo-state form they want in whatever culture they want. And, that's an option for them. So how is it that we lock onto existing national forms, privilege their existence, and actually, like, enforce their existence? Because that's another key difference here. One is you allow nations to exist. Another is you enforce the existence of existing nations. And so if you're going to do that, and then on top of that, have this accountable elite, it just seems like a very difficult job. So how do you do that?
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot there. I mean, firstly, I would object to this kind of structural description of the state that Ivan is putting forward. That the way I would describe America today is not that there are a bunch of state elites, but there are non-state elites. I think the most powerful people in the system are people who work for non-government entities who are funded by basically an investor elite. He described that, like, the market, it kind of, in order to succeed in the market, you get rewarded by producing things and providing them to consumers in an efficient and effective way, and you get rewarded for this. But in reality, the way the system actually works, you can't just think about producers and consumers. You have to think about investors. Investors are the ones that make the real money, and their allocation of resources. I mean, I understand that, you can start talking about central banking, and you can start talking about, regulations by the state that provide protections to these figures. But of course, they lobbied to get them put in place in the first place. So, you kind of, it's a bit of a chicken and egg thing. But nevertheless, the case is that you have an elite, an investor elite, who fund this kind of series of think tanks and NGOs. These are the kind of figures that are primarily responsible for formulating government policy. The people who actually, work in the bureaucracy of the state are trained often within these institutions or in and are impacted by private media and how they kind of condition the discourse and so on. And so there is this kind of civil society. I mean, that's really the core of what liberalism, its kind of narrative for how it sells itself, is that you have this kind of independent civil society which exists independently of the state, and that's kind of where this public discussion is going on that eventually kind of spins out into state policy. But this civil society, it's supposed to be distinguished from business, but it isn't really. It's totally privatized, you could say. The kind of the intelligentsia are all basically on the payroll of Wall Street bankers and so on in the United States. I mean, that in order to put forward a kind of coalition of political operatives that can actually get policy done in Washington, you need to have a whole bunch of donors, not just for your campaigns, but for this kind of fundamental kind of apparatus to kind of develop policy in the first place. So they're working in their interests. They're not working in the interests of the state. The state is just a tool that's being used by these actors. Now, if we contrast this with the Chinese system, there is no independent civil society. Everything is kind of contained within the state, within the party structure. And what I kind of perceive in the Chinese state is that with this consolidated state structure, they seem to be moving more towards the common good. Like they've just announced some reforms recently to ban so-called non-medical abortions, to introduce taxes on single women in their 20s, to address birth rates. I mean, they have a very kind of clear nationalism. They don't have immigrants pouring into the country and so on. It's almost saying it's a perfect society, but a lot of the actions that the state is taking in China seem to be genuinely motivated by what's in the interest of China as a 5,000-year-old nation continuing into the future. Whereas what I see in the United States is the denial that the American nation even exists and that it has any kind of common interests, and this kind of definition of the kind of raison d'etre of the state being the elevation of minorities and their interests, which are kind of like a series of different dependents upon a structure that just enriches this particular elite's, current power structure, where they've essentially kind of sectioned off participation in the political process from conventional Americans. So when I'm kind of looking at this kind of dichotomy, my view is not really like the state is the problem, but more, preventing private interests from being able to use the state to kind of serve their own private interests, as opposed to which is actually the formal definition of tyranny, when you have people ruling you who rule in their own interest rather than the common interest. Whereas a consolidated state form in China seems to be performing much better in terms of moving towards the common good. So I think that's kind of where I'm coming from when I'm looking at this, saying, well, I think the problem is liberalism, not attacking the state more, because what liberalism seems to do is it kind of converts attacks against the state into the kind of neoliberal order, takes those attacks against the state and then kind of like regurgitates them into a kind of its notion of legitimacy of, well, yes, like we have a liberal democracy and we have independent civil society and we have free speech and all of these things. And it just becomes a way to reinforce, the power of these elite private interests within the system, and prevent anyone from using state power to crush them and break them up and restore something more akin to policy in the common good, directed at the common good.
If I could just press you on that point, though, how do you keep a national elite accountable? Like, what's the mechanism for getting the right people in elite positions and then keeping them accountable?
Well, I think fundamentally you need to have a theory of what legitimates state power, and what is the common good and so on. That needs to be kind of academically institutionalized, so that you can credit people and train people and give people accreditation in awareness or competence in kind of analyzing and discussing the state in terms of these principles. And that currently actually exists in the United States, but the problem is that I think the kind of ideological structure of kind of is so bad that it's just training people in this bad ideological structure. But they do run the U.S. government according to that ideology quite effectively. It's not as though like there isn't some kind of coherent ideological self-image that's being reproduced there, and the same is the case in China. Like in China, they clearly have a kind of state philosophy which is being implemented. They also have meritocratic methods of working out how you kind of ascend up and down the hierarchy. So like if you look at like President Xi's career, obviously he started at kind of in a lower administrative level, like a local regional level, and he just was competent in everything that he did. As he kind of ascended the hierarchy, he just kept doing a great job, and eventually he gets all the way to the standing committee. And in order to even get into being in the party bureaucracy in the first place, they have very like rigorous academic testing and so on, and you have to be like in the top 2% to even like get in. And so there is this, and this is not something that's necessarily that new. This idea of having a kind of academic kind of filtration mechanism to kind of get yourself into the elite is obviously something that's universal. We see it with a lot of elite society, a lot of civilized societies throughout history, even in the United States. I mean, if you want to be an elite in the United States, you kind of need to go to an Ivy League university or another prestigious university. But the problem is, well, how are these institutions organized? It seems to me that in the United States, again, to criticize the United States, they've become corrupted. They aren't genuinely meritocratic. If you look at there's a great article written by Rob Unz called "The Myth of American Meritocracy," which was published in the American Conservative, where he talks about how Ivy League universities in the US, and they're not controlled by just whoever gets the best SAT scores gets in. And he wasn't just complaining about affirmative action, but also about how there are these admissions councils that kind of ideologically vet entrants and so on. So if you're a kind of Christian, conservative, white male, good luck going to Harvard or Yale or any of these places. Like even if you have like the best SAT scores, you just won't be allowed in. And he contrasted this with Caltech, which is one of the few universities that just goes just off SAT scores, and the demographics of Caltech are just different than the rest of the other elite universities, to kind of demonstrate his point. So you would want to kind of create meritocratic institutions and academic institutions, and you would need to have a good ideology, which is a philosophical problem, to then kind of accredit your elite, and then have a kind of, again, another meritocratic structure within the state for how you kind of, that you get a smaller assignment, and then, you get kind of promoted up the chain, like, which is how it works in any business, any corporation. So it wouldn't be any different than what a libertarian could say about why the free market is so good. And you get kind of promoted up the chain. Ultimately, it's just about the end that the state is directed towards. The U.S. government is very good at pursuing the end that it's directed towards. It's directed towards bad ends. So it's really seems to me to be a redesign of its, as I said, like its actual raison d'etre, its actual ideological self-image.
Okay, a couple things to sort of go through this. First, about China. You don't think that the Chinese Communist Party has its own interests? I mean, I'll just its own particular interests as distinct from the general interest of the Chinese people. I'll give you a simple example. In China, no one is allowed to privately own land. Now, why is that? Why did the CCP reach that decision? Why did it say that? Is it because it's somehow in the common good for no one to be allowed to own land and for all land to be controlled by the government? Or is it because that's a very effective means for the CCP to wield power and to wield control over resources and to enrich its own membership, and thereby also by extension to control the real estate market, for example, because in China there's an enormous amount of like state-connected banks, And since the entire market for land and by extension real estate is connected to the state, the whole thing is like just a massive state-run organization. And of course, we all know what's happening to the real estate sector in China now. It's collapsing. But be that as it may, I'm just making the point, like, this is not done for some notion of the common good. This is done because, like, elites in the Chinese Communist Party said, if we control this, we will have power. So let's control this, and to hell with what's good for anyone else. The same is true for the U.S. government, only in a different sense. Yes, there's a kind of complex network of, like, private companies interacting with the state and getting favorable policies passed, protections against market competition, various regulations to keep stuff, keep their for companies to keep their market positions. You mentioned the investor class. Well, I mean, technically, from the standpoint of economic theory, like, investors are producers, because investment is just intertemporal coordination of resources. Like, it's taking resources and then investing them into the future with, like, sending them out into the future in the hope of, like, some future return. So it is a kind of like intertemporal production. But be that as it may, I mean, you've pointed this out, that all of these people are, like, connected to the state through the Federal Reserve, through its, like, loose monetary policy, and the fact that the Fed acts as, like, a lender of last resort for banks whenever their fractional reserve pyramid schemes collapse. There's this whole network of protections designed to safeguard these people. And yes, it's true that these actors and these firms are using the state for their own personal economic interests, but they're using that power because it's there to be used. I mean, if you have this enormous center of power, like, obviously people are going to try to co-opt it. Obviously they're going to try to use it. It's too attractive. It's too tempting not to. And given the power that the state has and the damage that it's able to wreak when it makes a mistake, yeah, it would be better to just get rid of this whole thing. Because at least if you just have a network of private companies that are responsive to market feedback, you can, as I mentioned earlier, localize and limit any damage that's done. It's not to say that there won't be things go wrong. Humans are fallible. They do stupid things, obviously. But there will be institutional safeguards to minimize this. Whereas with the existence of the state, that's just not there. The only check, really, the only check really would be things like elections, and even that's not much of a check, because you can just, manipulate the populace through the media or whatever, and just, like, get the CIA to, tell all the mainstream journalists, what to say on the news and so forth. So the checks that exist are, like, nominal. They're not serious checks, because at the end of the day, you have to pay your taxes. Like, you can't refuse to pay if you're not happy with the service. Whereas with a private company, you can do this. And that's ultimately why market checks are effective, and these kind of state pseudo checks are not, because they're not meaningful forms of resistance to the state. They're not meaningful forms of, like, hitting it where it hurts when it does something bad. Yeah.
Well, to kind of discuss the China thing, if you had what happened in 2008 happen in China, they wouldn't have been bailed out. They would have been, a lot of these bankers would have been executed and bankrupted. We have seen many instances of executed bankers in China, like, who kind of committed financial crimes, but also, we just had Evergrande, basically its pyramid scheme, go belly up. And instead of the state bailing it out because it was too big to fail, it forced them to kind of pay down their debts entirely. And then the state steps in to help the other entities affected, as opposed to bailing out, like, the kind of particular entity which messed up. It seems to be a fundamentally different structure of power in China, where the state actually is in charge, not these private financial interests. So again, I don't really think that it's the case that because you have a state, it's just natural that a bunch of these elite bankers are going to start running it. I think that's a symptom of liberalism, not statism in general. Also, when you said in China people can't own land technically, well, yeah, technically that might be the case, but in practical terms, you basically still can. And the home ownership rate in China is one of the highest in the world. It's like 90%. In the United States and Australia, it's only 65%, and it's falling. So it seems as though the Chinese system is actually working quite effectively to help people own their own house. Um, Now, again, I just don't see the like. Ultimately, when you said yes, the Chinese Communist Party has some of its own self-interest to hold on to power. Like, obviously, that's true. Um, but to me, I think they have a pretty good case for saying why that's actually in the national interest, because they could say, well, look, we are like the stability of the country is kind of dependent upon the stability of our rule. And our rule has been effective. Look at all the economic growth, look at all the social development we've achieved, and so on. And it seems as though that the Chinese people generally agree. If you look at polling, um, like a supermajority of Chinese people are satisfied with their government. Um, President Xi has some of the highest approval rates of any world leader. Whereas in the United States, the same polling shows that you almost never get over 50% approval of a president or of a particular government, and so on. So, in my view, if you look at like from an outcomes-based perspective, that system is working a lot better than this kind of liberal system in the United States. So I think the state can work. It just needs to actually kind of flex itself. And that's why I said I don't believe in like liberal democratic elections as a way to kind of really limit state power. I mean, maybe they can be used for like a populist movement to leverage to try and do something. But ultimately, I agree that they are a joke. Generally speaking, they're just kind of performative for the purposes of legitimating the system. But that's why I don't really propose them as a solution. I think the solution has to be the state in its like internal ideological identity, which is mediated through a kind of academic and philosophical elite, philosopher kings, if you will, running it according to ethical principles.
Right. Okay. So there's one I still kind of yet to be resolved technical point. Why should we expect states to have the advantage in arriving at philosopher kings? Should they be able to identify true philosophical principles? Should these type of bureaucracies be able to do that? That's not really clear. Also, the accountability issue is not really clear, but I'm more interested in the philosophical issue. One of the classical arguments for liberalism is that we don't actually know the true philosophy, whatever it is. And if identifying the common good is contingent on identifying the true philosophy, the state form has the disadvantage that once you lock in those philosophical priors, that's what's informing your bureaucracies, your universities. That's the monopoly, worldview. And what if it's wrong? With China, maybe they're creating a prosperous society. I don't really know. I've never been there. I don't know how fragile it may be. But what if they identify that Christianity is a threat to the Chinese national identity and ban it? Then, according to your philosophical views, they are doing like the exact opposite of the common good. If salvation is through Christ, China, whatever other good it does, it bans worship of Christ. It's just condemned hundreds of millions of people potentially to hell. So, why should we expect states? Yeah, why should we expect states to be able to identify that true philosophy? The libertarian solution seems to have the advantage that you can have these, pseudo micro states that have all the same bureaucratic mechanisms that you're talking about, but there's always the freedom to just leave and go somewhere else, and you're not locked into this one government that you're under. So, in a way, the market might find that true philosophy-inspired leadership somewhere or other, and that you would expect would become the popular one, right? Because it's true. So why should we expect states in particular to be able, and nation states in particular, to find true philosophy? And what about that risk that once people believe they have the true philosophy and it's wrong, then you might be locking in, a lot of harmful practices.
Well, I would just retort by saying, well, if it's so hard to work out what the true philosophy is, then it's just as hard for markets as it is for states. There's no reason. You just said presumably a true philosophy would be more popular. I don't see why it follows. Why can't bad philosophy be more popular? It seems like today bad philosophies are very popular. I don't really see why it follows.
Okay, so bad philosophies seem popular today, I think, partly because states are pushing in their education systems a certain ideology that's been the consensus among Western elites, because it's locked in, because they have that monopoly on force. They're incentivized to arrive at this unified worldview to consolidate their power. And I think any organization is going to have that. And so the only way to have true like diversity of philosophical thought is to have many options. That's kind of the classical, liberal.
We do have religious and relative like pluralism. There's certain ideas that you can't discuss, like particularly when it comes to anything to do with national socialism or racism. That's all been very much kind of pushed out of what's possible to kind of discuss in polite society. But there's relative pluralism in philosophy. Like you can find people in universities that come from diverse philosophical perspectives, diverse religious perspectives. There's no real oppression of any particular religious group in our society. But nevertheless, we are undergoing total degradation of I don't really see why we're going to, again, this kind of gets back to what I was saying before about how I don't trust markets, because if the individuals who make up those markets are immoral, then the markets will just produce immoral ends. There's nothing inherent I see within markets to moralize their participants. Markets are just tools that give participants what they want. Directing people to the good, it requires either kind of like rational discourse and education and so forth, or it requires like direct force. Neither of these things are really like inherent why a market would select them, or any more than a state would select them.
I want to back out of this just one point on that. It's the contrast is you can inherently, when you're part of a society, you will be inculcated with certain philosophical norms. I do think that certain schools of thought are privileged over others because of the interests of an elite class that exists. So the question is, are you getting informed philosophically by someone who has a gun to your head and you're not allowed to leave their stewardship and authority? Or, will you have a better chance finding the truth if you are allowed to look at different options?
Well, potentially, like,
I'll step out of it now.
If they have a gun to my head, preventing me from, or preventing people in my society from engaging in the sale of illicit drugs, and this seems to be good for my philosophical development, because if I'm doing methamphetamines and heroin and so forth, I'm going to be worse at coming to philosophical truth than if I'm sober. So there are many instances in which violence can be used for pro-social ends, in such a way that it violates people's individual liberties. I don't see any kind of, and I can think of other examples if you want to go through them. I think it's a very trivial argument that this idea that like markets, because they provide freedom, they're just going to kind of create these natural conditions for good ideas to rise. There's nothing inherent. There's no reason that I've been provided why they're going to help good ideas better than bad ideas. Now you could say, well, states, they make a more of a hard decision, so they can more actively suppress bad ideas, but at the same time they can more forcefully push good ideas. So it just seems like you're just talking about two different mechanisms that are essentially value neutral, and you're not really giving me an argument as to why either of them is going to be more or less capable of tending towards positive values. You're just saying that the state it's got more power to suppress good and impose bad. But I'm arguing, but it also has more power to promote good and suppress bad. There doesn't really seem to be a counter argument here, just a kind of acknowledgement of this, which I'm not even arguing with. So to me, but also secondarily beyond this, the issue that I have is I don't really think libertarian society is even possible in pragmatic terms anyway. So this debate is kind of frivolous on those grounds, because ultimately the concentration of power by states is, in kind of raw power terms, more effective and than the alternative. And basically, if you have like a world where there's a bunch of states and then like one state collapses, that power vacuum can just be exploited by the other states who are going to have many advantages over local populations who don't have a state to defend them against these foreign states. So I just don't really see any like non-state future even being possible in the first place. I don't think it's really even viable. So then to me, it's just a question of, well, how do you solve the problem of the state? I agree that there are problems with the state. States aren't like naturally good. As I said, they're value neutral, but it's like, well, how do you kind of put good values on the state really seems to be the only relevant political question. And libertarianism seems to be freaking out about how hard this is and then hoping kind of impotently to abolish the state in a way that's actually never going to, like, it's not going to actually happen. It's not, in my view.
No. Like a couple things. The argument being made about why the state is ineffective as a means of promoting, let's say morality generally, just a good, well-behaved populace, is because the elite connected with the state, the politicians, the bureaucrats, the people who actually work there, or the people that are connected to the state through various favors and patronage networks and so forth, they have an incentive to use that mechanism to remain in power. And that their desire to remain in power does not necessarily comport with whether the population is good or bad. And if then remaining in power requires them to push immoral ideas, or make it so that the population degrades morally, like, they're going to do it and they're not going to care, because the aim is to stay in power. And the reason that this is so devastating is that the state has the power to insulate itself from feedback. Again, the cardinal characteristic of the state is that you have to pay your taxes. It is the one organization that is able to conscript resources from society by force, and you may not refuse the request of the state for that conscription. And so if it comes to be in the interest of state elites to promote something bad, they can give those bad ideas a shelf life that is much longer than what it might otherwise have, because without that insulation from the state, those bad ideas will be exposed to feedback from the rest of society. As an example, I mentioned welfarism and the promiscuity of the underclass. If you don't have a welfare state to subsidize these people, they're going to be extremely poor. They're not going to be able to survive that way. It's just not going to be a viable mode of living. Whereas the subsidies granted to them make their lifestyles viable. So this is something that actively encourages bad behavior, and purposely encourages it because it is in the interest of the elite to encourage it because it keeps them in power. It keeps these people voting for the politicians that dole out these favors, and so on. So the power interests of those in the state are completely, they bear no relation to what's moral or immoral, and they're going to do whatever they need to do to maintain power. The state's ability to conscript resources then magnifies its ability to do that. In a market, you don't have that situation because everyone is vulnerable to collapse, to bankruptcy, to social feedback. You don't have to pay any company for its services if you don't want to pay for that company's services. If you find that the CEO of some company is like, an immoral rake or a drug addict, you can say, well, I don't support this. I'm going to withdraw my money. You can't stop paying your taxes because you don't like the president, So that's the issue. It's the relative insulation versus vulnerability from social feedback of one form versus the other, which makes the state more capable of producing bad outcomes, and therefore a greater danger than a market would be. That's the argument.
I agree that the state is more capable of bad outcomes. I just also think that it's more capable of good outcomes as well. But secondarily, I would just kind of ask you, let's say the state...
Wait, why though? Why is the state more capable of good outcomes? Any bureaucratic institution you're proposing could be imposed in a kind of Hoppian pseudo-state, could it not? What does the state have insofar as it is imposing its rule by violence that allows it to get to the greater good better than, some billionaire who has 10,000 acres and has his little micro state there under his own direct control.
Okay, well, you're just saying what's the difference between a big state and a small state? I mean, that's not really relevant to the question of statism. But also, I don't understand how you can say that. Like, my argument is markets don't constrain immoral individual decisions outside of violations of other people's property rights. So there is no mechanism that markets provide to prevent people from engaging in those moral actions, but states do have mechanisms to prevent people from engaging in those immoral actions. Therefore, states are capable of producing particular goods which markets aren't capable of producing.
No,
Secondly,
this example.
But markets are capable of doing that. You can refuse to patronize someone whom you consider to be immoral.
No, I'm not saying markets are incapable of imposing any moral judgments. I'm saying there are particular moral judgments which can't be enforced by markets, which can be enforced by states. The example I already gave you was this basic idea of there is no heroin trade or pornography, or we talked about contraception or these.
I don't want to hire heroin addicts to work at my company.
But ultimately they don't need to work at your company because they ultimately they can still do heroin somewhere else. There's heroin addicts can still subsist and exist in society in some way. You're just saying, well, they're not going to work in my company, but you're not actually stopping them from doing heroin.
It's not just me. It's the relation of the general temper of society. Like if people are in agreement that we don't want to hire heroin addicts because they're irresponsible or they're losers and they can't be trusted or whatever, well then there's going to be social disincentives and social pressure against that kind of lifestyle. And
well, that's true. That's true anyway. I mean, it's not because we live under states, people are just hiring heroin addicts.
Yes, exactly. That's my point. Yes, that's the point.
But what I'm saying is that the market can't fundamentally stop the problem at the source. It can just insulate property owners from some of its effects. It's not really the same thing.
Neither can the state.
Of course the state can. The state can just literally kill all drug dealers if it wants to. It could arrest and murder all of them. Or not murder,
if drug dealers pay off the state.
Okay, but I'm saying the state can. Now you're saying, well, the state can do something else, but that's not really relevant. I'm saying the state has the capacity to make drug dealing illegal.
Let's just look at this one example more carefully. If we could, just one thought experiment here to look whether this is the case. Okay, pure libertarianism exists. Donald Trump buys 10,000 acres and forms his own exclusive society where his laws, his bureaucracies, everything he wants are instituted. If he catches anyone doing heroin, they're out. So there you go. He has this kind of well-defined society. All the mechanisms.
Described a nice little state that's.
But that's not a state because you are allowed to leave. You're allowed to enter or leave based on.
I'm allowed to leave Australia if I want to.
Only if another state accepts you. What are you going to do? Live on a boat somewhere?
Lots of other states will accept me.
Within the context of this Donald Trump formed community, I assume that there are property owners other than Donald Trump himself. There are other people who own pieces of land, and Trump might say, well, I have a company and we provide, protection services. We'll protect your company, like some sort of insurance firm. And now I assume in the example you've set up that you can choose either to pay for that service or not, right? If you have the option to not pay for Trump's protection services for your property, then yes, that's not a state. You don't have the option to not pay the state.
Well, actually, I do. If I left Australia and went to another country, then I can just stop paying taxes to the Australian government.
Okay, that's kind of the key issue here. So going back to can a market arrive at true philosophy better than a state? Also,
you guys are just describing another kind of state. It's pretty funny. It's what libertarians always do. They just invent another state.
This idea that by just leaving, by leaving the society and going to another society, you solve the problem of a state that makes bad decisions and enforces bad values. Doesn't that run into conflict, though, with a commitment towards ethno-nationalism or something like that? That seems to favor a more liberal, voluntarist model of what the state is and what it does, where states are various service providers and we're free to choose which service provider we like. And if there's more options, and if they're not locked in by like inherent biological identities that must be respected, then it seems like you solve some of these problems more easily.
Well, I disagree with this idea, because if you convert states into just service providers, you fundamentally undercut the principles of their legitimacy, which is their relation to a particular people and a history and a community and a set of values, which morally, or which hopefully, like if you have good values, I guess, but like can morally and particularistically kind of define what the kind of state's principles are, what its laws are going to be, what its values are, that correspond to your like organic identity as belonging to a particular ethnic group. Usually particular ethnic groups have a particular religious tradition that corresponds to them. They have, as an Anglo-Saxon, we have particular legal norms that correspond to how Anglo-Saxons like to organize their societies and so on, which go into defining this combination of kind of Anglo common law and Christian values and so on, created Australia, for example, and created Australia within this particular cultural paradigm. Now, a bunch of Muslims who want to move here have decided, well, actually in Australia, because there's a bunch of white people there doing white people stuff, it's actually more profitable for me to live there, even though I don't share any of these values. So I'm going to immigrate from, my shithole country where I come from to Australia because I want access to white people and all the economic benefits that provides. And then they fundamentally undermine the kind of fabric of my society. And this is bad. So I would say, well, no, I don't want you coming in. I only want people here who are going to share the same values, so that the government and the laws can kind of maintain their integrity, because this is like society as a reflection of itself. So that's kind of where the you could even put it within your guys' terms as like the collective, all the property owners of Australia, or the majority of them, come together and say, we don't want immigrants coming into the country undermining our collective property rights or whatever. I mean, traditionally, classical liberalism was you'd have all these white men owning property in a particular location, and they'd all vote in representatives that would, be racist on their behalf. I mean, that was what classical liberalism was. I'm not really saying that that's a bad thing, but what I am saying, though, is that when it comes to, I got like a more realist view than you guys, where you're just kind of describing this alternative configuration of developing a state. There's no libertarianism there. Like, libertarianism is this kind of void. Like, if you're describing all of these natural power incentives that, if you have an elite, they want to have a state to protect them from the kind of repercussions of their actions, because if they don't have a state protecting them, then there's all these mechanisms by which the power can be eviscerated by free interactions. Okay, let's say I'll accept that argument. So then what's stopping them, if we get rid of the state, just building a new one? If you don't have a state of your own to protect your interests against these people, how exactly are you supposed to protect yourself? It seems like you'd have to get together and create some kind of collective security apparatus that would prevent anyone else from building a state within your territory. And you've just built a new state. That's literally what a state is. So you're just asserting sovereignty over a territory with this kind of security apparatus to kind of maintain a legal structure in a particular way. So to me, it just seems like libertarianism is ridiculous. It's just like there is no like non-statist solution. There's just like revising a particular state and coming up with a different one.
We have to be clear about the definition of what a state is. It's an organization claiming the territorial right to initiate violence within a given territory, a monopoly on that, and the right to tax, meaning the right to conscript resources from the population it oversees, and that the population from which it conscripts those resources doesn't have the right to refuse that request. Okay, so this is different from like an insurance company. You don't want to pay the insurance premium, fine, you don't pay. You don't get insurance, but if you don't want to pay, if you want to self-insure, or you want to go to a different company, you pay them. I mean, but to say that if that even if you have the ability to refuse to pay some particular insurance company, that well, then you'll just have to go to another insurance company, and that's sort of the equivalent of a state anyway because you're paying someone. Or even if you don't pay any companies at all and you self-insure, well, that's also the equivalent of a state because you're like creating your own state by self-insuring. I mean, no, I think you're just this is obviously not the case. The important thing is whether you're able to refuse the request for payment. If you are, and the organization in question leaves you alone and lets you go about your day after your refusal, then it's not a state. If it doesn't,
But you seem to be kind of complaining like as if as if the state is coming in and imposing itself upon you and not letting you leave. Well, actually, you can renounce citizenship and leave. You just have nowhere to go, and then you're blaming your
well,
government, saying, "Oh, I've got nowhere to go. I'm stuck here, and I have like." It's like, well, okay, well, too bad. Pay taxes, bitch. Like you have nowhere else to go.
then, are we talking about ethics here, or are we talking about the kind of realities?
Because if you did have somewhere else to go, they're not going to stop you.
Well, I mean, it depends. I mean, it depends on the state. There are, in North Korea, they're going to stop you.
Okay, well, we could say that that's morally wrong for them to stop you. Most states won't stop you, though. In fact, it's like most states have agreed with the UN Charter that it's a human right for you to be able to leave if you want to leave.
Right, but the world is populated by states. So if you say that if you don't like living under a particular state, you can go to another state, well, and then your only option is to choose between one of a various assortment of states. The problem I have with this is that it assumes that the state effectively owns the territory over which it claims dominion. Like what I'm saying is, well, no, I shouldn't abandon like the land that I live on, my house, my property, and so forth, just because I don't like the state. The state doesn't have a right to this. It's mine. Not it doesn't belong to the state. To
Well, I would
presume
argue
that
the
I
state
should
does
be
have a right to it, actually.
to presume that I should be the one to leave is to say that the state is the owner of quote unquote my property rather than me.
But where does your property right fundamentally come from? Because you bought your property of someone else, you bought it of someone else, and we kind of chase it back through. You know, we can go back to like the founding of the United States in your case, and the founding of the United States was a bunch of property owners coming together under classical liberal principles and saying, no taxation, no taxation without representation. So then they set up a republic of property owners, which provides representation in exchange for property rights. Now you could like argue that, well, you didn't like how the Constitution was amended to enable income tax, and you find the state has become illegitimate because it's violated those initial principles. But that wouldn't really make you someone who is anti-statist. I think it would just be like you're quibbling over the
I don't think
particular
it was
nature of the
legitimate
state.
to begin with.
Why wasn't it legitimate?
Well, because of what a state is, it's an organization that presumes the right to violate property rights. That's essentially
Yeah,
what.
but the property, I guess we got to get to the kind of core here of where do property rights come from? Because you seem to think that like individuals can like spontaneously generate their own property rights, but a right is a social construct. A right is something which a community agrees to kind of recognize that its participants have. Um,
Okay.
so if a community is coming together and agreeing, okay, people are going to have claims to properties, this kind of presumes a prior community behind that property right, and that community, I'm arguing, corresponds or should correspond ideally to the state. And we could say, well, this state is illegitimate because it has kind of turned its back on any kind of authentic representation of the community it's governed. And obviously I would argue that as a nationalist, in the contemporary order. And so the state should be reformulated so it genuinely represents the community. But in like an ideal kind of notion of the state where it does actually represent the community it governs, then your property rights are generated by the state and its legal norms and so on, defending them, constructing them, and so forth. Your property right doesn't exist independently of of that community as an individual or independently of the legal structure that governs that community. I don't see where it really comes from philosophically.
Aren't there certain God-given rights?
Yes.
What? No, I don't. Where is the God-given right to like homestead? I don't understand where that comes from.
Well, we inhabit a world with finite. We inhabit a finite world with resources, and we need to make use of those resources in order to flourish and develop our capacities. And if you accept an Aristotelian conception, let's say, of ethics, and you say that what you should do is to develop your potentialities, whatever those are. Well, in order to do that, you're going to need to interact with the physical stuff of the world, and there's going to need to be some kind of like property nexus to mediate that interaction. So how can you achieve your telos given the finite world as it is with its kind of constraints? How can you do that without some notion of property?
Yeah. So I'm not against the notion of property, but what I'm saying is that notion of property is bound up within my membership and participation in the community. If I'm going to say I'm going to I'm going to abandon all my obligations to this community to pay taxes and to participate in those obligations, then your rights also should get dissolved when you abandon those obligations. In my view, you can't have it both ways. You're just saying I should have my rights, but I refuse my obligations. That seems
Well,
to be totally irreciprocal.
well, wait a minute. Why does community equate to state? I mean, can't you have a community of people, of individuals with fellow feeling for one another who are bonded by language, common history, or what have you, but who simply decide not to have a coercive taxing apparatus
Well,
administering?
yeah, they could decide to change the tax system so that it would be more reasonable. Like you
Well,
probably
not
wouldn't
well, not
object to paying
not
taxes if you
change the
thought your
tax,
taxes were being spent
not
well, right?
not change the tax system. I said not have one at all.
Okay, but like, so the community is directed towards the common good. And the common good of the community is to have security, is to have laws. You don't want to have, criminals being able to kind of
I agree.
run around and engage in criminal behavior. So you need to have some mechanism for bringing people to justice, which means you need a police force, you need military to stop outside invaders coming in. Um, and then, there's other certain goods that the community benefits from, like having roads and having transportation and having like, a kind of energy grid and all these different things. And so this ends up kind of accruing a whole series of costs that someone needs to pay for. So it
I,
seems to me quite natural that you would need to bring in a tax system to pay for all of that.
I mean, I agree with all of that. I agree that a community will need those things. Again, it doesn't follow that you need a tax system. I mean, why do you think it does? Is it because of the complexity of administering the service? I mean, there are all kinds of extremely difficult to provide complex goods that are not administered by the state, and if markets are able to do so without, you know, the
Why
direct.
do they? Why do markets need to do it? Like if the state can do it, and most people are generally happy with that, and it's working. If the state is actually achieving what it's setting out to achieve, and it's logical, like here's why we need to do this, here's why it's in the common good, and we're achieving it, and so you need to pay for it. I mean, how can you really object to that? I don't understand. Where do you get
Well,
off?
The imposition of force,
yeah, yeah,
ultimately.
the
But
Okay, but too
violation
bad.
of
It's
property.
like you want to be part of the community. This is what if you want to be part of this community, we need to have these things paid for. So everyone needs to chip in. Here's our way of, organizing the agreement.
but
If you don't
then
like
you're
it,
saying it has to be
leave.
through a state. I mean, he just addressed
Yeah,
that argument, saying it could be a community that doesn't enforce
Okay,
taxation and
it could
such.
be. It could be, but let's say the particular community that you're in has a state, and the majority of the people in that community aren't libertarians. So there is kind of like a mass consent for the state, as well as like the state is actively providing all these services which you benefit from. So if you're going to continue living in that community and benefiting from all of those services and engaging with that community and its values, which are fundamentally statist and so on, I don't see how you can argue that you don't have an obligation to pay taxes.
well, you can only argue that you do if you presume that the state has the right to do what it's doing. See that's the problem.
But what I'm arguing is that you're implicitly you're kind of implicitly consenting to its right in a way by kind of living in that community and benefiting from everything it has to offer you.
But
And that community is sustained by that structure of rules and that structure of norms. And so if you're going to kind of refuse all of your obligations to that structure of norms, it seems to me that you don't really deserve to kind of demand any rights, including the right to respect your property rights. I don't really see where the claim comes from.
I'm saying that presumes that the state has the right to impose the demands in the first place. I mean, the goods that you described, social order, security, etc., can be generated by other non-state.
But they're not being generated by non-state.
Let's look at another thought experiment here to clarify, I think, what's happening. It seems like this is equivalent to saying, I was born in a lab, and there are a team of scientists who have given me all my meals and etc. Control the environment. I owe everything to them because I'm here in this laboratory. And it hasn't occurred to me to escape because I'm under the impression this is all there is. So, is it legitimate?
I mean, there is no impression that, you can leave, if you can leave the country and you are under the impression that you can't, there's nothing stopping you, and you have the ability to renounce citizenship and completely leave behind the country that you live in, then you're not being held there by force. You're staying there through choice.
Except that the rest of the world is controlled by similar states, and that's
if you're in America,
that has not always been the case. That has not always been the case.
It's kind of its fault how the rest of the world is organized to an extent, but
let me try a different thought experiment. Okay, suppose I decided to start dumping my garbage into your yard, and then you began objecting that I'm dumping my garbage into your yard, and you're like, hey, stop dumping the garbage. And I'm like, well, if you don't like it, just leave. Now, obviously, your response would be, well, wait a minute, you don't have the right to tell me to leave. This is my yard. You're the one who's in the wrong by dumping your garbage into my yard. That's essentially the point I'm making about this.
Okay, but if the guy's say it's your neighbor, and the guy is you're in a bad neighborhood, and everyone's house is getting robbed, and there's rapists roaming the streets and all kinds of terrible things, but your neighbor is like a gangster. He's like a mob boss, and your house, because you're his buddy, you're totally protected from all of these different elements, because he's like, no one is going to mess with him and anyone who's under his protection. And he's inviting you over for dinner, and his wife is friends with your wife, and the kids play together, and he's like a great buddy of yours, and he's like, listen, man, I got all this and you do Christmases together and stuff. And he's like, hey, look, man, I got all this stuff. I got nowhere to put it. Can I dump it in your yard for a couple months till I get rid of it? And you don't really have anything, it's kind of an inconvenience, but you could deal with it. You'd be kind of a dick to be like, no, fuck you. It's my house. You can't tell me what to do. It's like, okay, you could assert that right, but then it's like you're going to destroy the relationship that's providing you all these benefits, because you do have all these implied obligations to this person built up over time. So it's like, yeah, okay, I guess in principle you could object to him using your yard, but then at the same time you couldn't also have a problem with him relinquishing all of the benefits that you accrue from him either, and then treating you like an enemy and sending his guys over to your house to treat you like he treats his other enemies. You kind of are relinquishing all of this kind of, you get what I'm saying?
Well, your example presumes like a certain amicable beginning to the relationship, what if the gangster just came along and put a gun to my head and said, all right, you're my bitch, basically. You grow produce for me. Yeah, these other rapists and so forth won't kill you, but you work for me and you do what I tell you to do. Well, yeah, he does provide me a kind of protection, but
what my argument for where the state's legitimacy comes from is that it's directed towards the common good. So if the state asks of you certain things, but overall it is directed towards the community's common good, and you're benefiting from being part of that community, that I think you have obligations. Now, you could argue that the state is fundamentally illegitimate, doesn't serve the community, it just abuses people and so on. Then I could kind of understand your objection to the state. But on an individual basis, just by saying, well, you can't tell me what to do, this seems to be quite juvenile and kind of just ignoring a whole set of other kind of social obligations and benefits that you're receiving and so on, with this kind of assertion of this kind of atomistic individuality, that to me seems kind of antisocial.
Well, again, I'm not doing any of those things. I'm not denying the existence of social obligations. I'm not denying the existence of social bonds. I'm just drawing a distinction between those which are forged forcibly and those which are not.
But just because something is forced forcibly doesn't mean that it's inherently wrong in my view. Like if it is motivated by the good, if it is for a good end, I don't see why violence is a problem, or the threat of violence is a problem inherently.
I think the issue is that violence qua violence is wrong. And if a greater good comes out of it, maybe the calculus makes sense. But I think your claim that the state is morally neutral is not true.
Yeah.
Inherently, it is.
In principle, it is. Obviously, not in practice. In practice, obviously, values.
No, in principle, the state involves the application of violence, and violence is wrong. So in principle, the state begins with a kind of debt that it is doing something wrong in the first place.
I don't know exactly how you define violence. Force is not always wrong. It's legitimate
Well,
to use
I
force.
agree. I agree. It's not always wrong. It's that it's initiating it against someone who hasn't violated the rights of anyone else that's wrong.
No, but that's the thing. If you have a society that's built upon, or a social arrangement, a political arrangement that's built upon a series of obligations, it's like, look, to achieve the common good, we're going to need to ask certain things from you. It's not just about what we can provide you, but we're also going to need to demand things from you. Then it's legitimate, if it's in the service of the common good, to use force to enforce those obligations, just like it's legitimate to use them to defend rights. I don't see why you're only looking at the right side of the balance sheet, but not looking at the duties and the obligations on the other side of the balance sheet.
In a community like one of these kind of Hoppian style restrictive covenants, the members of those communities came together and like voluntarily formed the community. And it wasn't like something where there's like a social contract and there's implicit consent. There's direct, explicit consent. Like, here I am, I'm explicitly signing my name to a document. I'm directly saying that I wish to be part of it, and I subsume myself under the obligations that are there. That's not how any state ever in history has been formed. Like all of the people who signed the US Constitution are dead. Right? And they presumed to bind people who were never born, who could not have even been asked for their consent because they didn't exist. Right? So
okay, so if on your 18th birthday, if you were handed a contract to say, look, you have two choices. You're going to be exiled from the United States, and we're not going to give you a passport. Or you sign this document that says you agree to the US Constitution, and then we'll hand you your passport, and you are now a US citizen. Would that, just by instituting that one mechanism, would that completely address your concerns?
well, it presumes that the personnel that make up the US government are the owners of the territory.
Okay, but you would be. It's asking you for consent if you want to consent to it or not. So if you don't want to be consented, if you don't want to consent to it, why would they tolerate you? Because they
no,
are fundamentally, all the other people who are consenting to it, they're fundamentally responsible for maintaining the security and integrity of the territory. That's why it exists. It's for their common good.
because I don't accept that the personnel comprising the US government have the right to make that decision in the first place, because they aren't the owners of the territory. If there was a different organization, let's say, composed of property owners, and we say, okay, look, these specified people own X, Y, and Z. You may join our community if you wish, but a condition of doing so is that you must abide by the following rules. That's fine, because that was established by the property ownership and transfer principles that I described in the beginning. So you could trace these communities back through acts of voluntary sale or transfer of property back to some act of original appropriation. You can have like a chain leading back to that. In that case, that's fine. With the case of the state, though, you have theft. Like the resources that it commands are not rightfully the state's. That's the issue.
I guess like it's just a difference of perspective on how property is formulated, you seem to think that like people homestead some empty territory and property is kind of built out of that. Where in my view, property rights are kind of generated top down. Like you need to have some kind of community that establishes sovereignty over a community that can then kind of acknowledge property claims within their sovereign territory for property to actually
Yeah,
be meaningful in its existence.
yeah. I mean, that's essentially the difference. Like you're a kind of legal positivist, whereas my view is that property rights are just kind of inherent in the nature of what it is to be human and what it is to inhabit, a finite world. That this is just a consequence of that. That it's something that you need in order to have social order at all.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with that statement, but I just think my formulation comports with it, which is that it's in human nature to have communities and to um, develop a kind of develop like norms and political structures which protect those communities from outsiders and maintain their kind of internal virtue of how people interact from within. And then property rights are kind of constructed upon that edifice. So like without having sovereignty declared over a particular territory upon which you can develop a universal legal order, I don't really know what property rights are. It's just some random guy goes into some empty area and says, "This is mine now." I don't understand where he gets the right to do that from, or why anyone should care about it.
It comes down to the metaphysics of rights. My own opinion is that it derives from like the naturalness of moral consequences. Someone has a right to something if when you violate it, you're going to incur a karmic debt, right? You're doing something wrong against that kind of natural moral order. And I think, in the sense that a individual family can go out and homestead something, someone can come attack, and what will happen? They're going to defend their territory. You're going to experience consequences. Other people find out about it. This person's going to be seen as a lawbreaker and a bad person, bad character. And so there is a natural kind of karmic dynamic that precedes any particular state. Even animals seem to recognize something like that, So the metaphysics of rights is significant here. I know we're running up to our time limit that we had discussed previously. So maybe we can try to kind of wrap it back together. What I'm seeing is basically like, Joel, you're having to appeal to the ability to leave a given state to like legitimate this, the authority of the state in the first place, because you're consenting tacitly. But that does seem to run into a contradiction with your preference for nation states. Because if you are like by nature,
response to what he was saying, then like
statement of the inconsistency is still real, though. I think so. That's an issue in your position that I think needs to be resolved. From what I can see, if the state gains legitimacy by tacitly agreeing to stay here, then the consequence would be the world order that we should encourage is one that allows the maximum, choice for what state you're subscribing to. If the legitimacy of it for the individual ultimately derives from, well, you're here, you're benefiting from it, well, then we should facilitate people going where they can be benefited all the more. And that I will note that does not destroy the ability for certain states, certain, communities to not allow certain types of immigration, to enforce whatever norms they want. But the ethno-nationalist position does seem to restrict mobility between states, and it does seem to then put you in that condition where you just have the gun to your head. You're stuck with what you have. There's no choice, and I would say that ties back into this philosophical underpinning. If the community is legitimated also by the pursuit of the common good, and that is discovered through philosophical methods, then the more that we're locked into at gunpoint a specific set of norms, the less I think we'll explore philosophically other options. I think that's the way that liberal societies have gone. That's like the American strategy in a sense, is like allowing as many things to happen as possible and then harvesting the best of it. And I think that kind of also explains what's going on geostrategically, the competition between China and the US. China is very majoritarian in its orientation, and it has a certain sort of real political power in that domain. Meanwhile, like we've gone for this extreme tail end of our society where we put a lot of resources into them and not into the majority. And I mean, we can control the weather, China can't, as far as I can tell. So I think that is a real advantage and a benefit of liberalism. But anyway, that's my final statement. Maybe the two of you can give final statements and we can wrap up.
I think the superiority of the United States is more down to, I would use like race realism, I think, in a big way to kind of work out why the US is doing so well. It just has like the best people. It was just like this like way of kind of just attracting all the talent out of European civilization into this like massive experiment. And whilst the United States was run by white nationalists, basically, like more or less, or white supremacists, or however you want to describe them, for almost 200 years. And so the kinds of people that they were bringing in and giving these rights and liberties to were of a particular quality and had particular values that they brought with them from Europe. Since they've deviated from that, it doesn't seem like it's trending in a positive direction at all, not just in terms of bringing in non-white migrants, but in terms of turning against a lot of traditional values of Western civilization, let's say, and like the atheism that's permeating through the society, and degenerate moral kind of norms and so on. But yeah, that's kind of a different thing. But I guess like for me, I just kind of take my view as I was a libertarian when I was in my late teens because there's a certain attraction to these ideas. I just, from a pragmatic standpoint, don't see them as viable. I think you just have to kind of figure out how to make state power work, because state power is powerful. There's so much incentive and kind of just inherent power like behind it. It's just like states are really powerful because states are really good at being powerful. So it's about trying to figure out how to direct them towards the good. It's about supplying them with the right ends and figuring out how to get those ends somehow into the state apparatus so that they can be a force for good rather than evil, because I don't think they're going anywhere. But also from a communitarian perspective, I think this kind of individualistic, as we were describing before, notion of property, I don't know if it's philosophically coherent to me. It's not as though I think that individual property rights don't have any value or something. Obviously, I think that they do. But I think community rights or group rights also have value. And I think that there are certain obligations individuals have to the communities around them, which should also be enforceable, not just individual rights against other members of the community. I think that makes a lot more sense morally and organically when just kind of thinking about how things work in my life. One example I will give is, you could say I have the absolute right to do whatever I want with my Saturday. But if my parents are moving house this Saturday or next Saturday, and they say, Joel, we need you to help us move house, I could assert my individual liberty and say, I'm not going to help you move house. It's my Saturday. I can do whatever the hell I want. But that would be kind of wrong because I have like an obligation to honor my parents and to help my parents as much as I can. If I got nothing else going on Saturday, I'm just going to sit around, watching football, eating Doritos or something. It would be a really bad thing for me not to help them. So I think, obligations are also kind of morally important. And they need to be brought into our kind of ethical accounting, as opposed to thinking about everything in terms of, you can't tell me what to do. I have the complete sovereign right to do what I want, and everything has to be built out of like voluntary consent. So yeah, I have more of like a balanced view or mixed view between these two positions. But that would be like my final statement.
Okay, I guess as my final statement, I'd just point out in response that I don't at all deny that man is a social being and that we need to live within a social context in order to be our truest and most developed selves. But the question that libertarianism turns to is simply the narrow question of under what circumstances for the use of force is acceptable. This does not mean that there aren't certain moral obligations that you might have, that there aren't certain things that you should do, which it nevertheless would still be wrong to coerce you to do. Like you should just do them because it's the decent thing to do. I certainly acknowledge the existence of these things. And furthermore, my objection is not to community, it is not to obligations to community, it's to the state form itself, specifically as a particular institution with particular characteristics, like the ability to tax and so forth. And I just don't see why we need this particular structure with all of its attendant problems, with its ability to insulate an elite from consequences. Why we need this in order to achieve the various social goods we have. I guess a quick, a lapidary way to put it is that the state is just too big not to fail, because the state marshals enormous resources and it attempts to direct and control a social system of enormous complexity. And there's just no way for a single centralized institution to process all of that information effectively, such that the results are optimal or even functional, depending on the stringency and the strength of the control. And so the more such control is exerted, the more the grip tightens, so to speak, the more the errors accumulate. And because of the state form, there are no ways to correct the errors. And so the errors get reinforced and things just get worse and worse and worse. And I don't want that. I want peaceful, flourishing societies where people are able to realize themselves and live good lives. And I think that because the state makes war against property rights, because it dismantles the division of labor and all these other things, it stands in opposition basically to civilization. So in a word, I'm a libertarian because I believe in civilization and I believe in its inherent good.
Okay, very nice. I should have enforced Joel having the last word because Ivan opened, so that's usually the etiquette, but it's all right. So anyway, this was very interesting. There are a few open questions, still to look at. I'm still interested in that idea of facilitating the discovery of true philosophy, because everything else hinges on that. Finding the common good requires true philosophy. So what way of life, what justificationary framework for community formation, etc., facilitates that true philosophical society? And maybe we can look at that question in the future. There's also this kind of double philosophy issue where on the one hand, we are kind of a priori philosophically discussing how societies, which themselves have philosophical systems that they enforce to a degree, how they come about and how they should come about. And then there's within already existing societies, philosophical paradigms. Of course, like we are in existing societies when we're discussing this a priori phase of the philosophy. So how properly to have that discussion is relevant not only to like discovering just in a purely philosophical sense the truth, but also like thinking about how geopolitical, philosophical, and legal thought ought to work, which is presumably like above the level of any particular framework. So that's also an issue. It's like if we start presupposing our philosophical conclusions that are culturally contingent, perhaps, maybe, when we're thinking about how societies ought to be formed, we're engaged in a form of question making. So how can we examine those presuppositions well enough to like actually get to the true a priori theorizing about the nature of society? That would be a task. And I don't know that we quite got there, but we did discuss a lot of good things. So thank you, Ivan and Joel. This was very enjoyable. Hopefully we can talk again soon.